The radio crackled with static as Commander Hayes watched the final candidate crawl through mud that had turned crimson in the dying light. His weathered hands gripped the observation post, railing so tightly his knuckles went white. 27 elite operators had entered the classified drill known only as the Crucible. 26 had failed, and the one person still moving through that hellish maze of obstacles wasn't supposed to be there at all. "Sir," Lieutenant Morrison whispered, his voice barely audible over the sound of distant explosions echoing across the training ground. "She's still going." Hayes pressed the binoculars harder against his eyes, tracking the lone figure as she navigated between mock IEDs and sniper nests that had claimed every other participant. Her name wasn't even supposed to be on the roster. 3 hours ago, he'd personally signed the rejection letter, yet somehow, she'd made it past every checkpoint, every guard, every impossible barrier designed to break the strongest soldiers alive. "How the hell did she even get in here?" Hayes muttered. But deep down, he already knew the answer would change everything he thought he knew about what it meant to be elite. But to understand how Staff Sergeant Elena Rodriguez became the ghost who haunted the most classified operation in military history, we need to go back to where it all began. 6 months earlier, Elena sat in the sterile waiting room of the VA hospital, her left hand unconsciously rubbing the scar that ran from her wrist to her elbow. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like angry wasps, casting everything in a sickly yellow glow that made her skin look jaundiced. She'd been waiting for 3 hours to see Dr. Brennan about the recurring nightmares that had been plaguing her since her discharge. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, a tired-looking woman in scrubs, finally called her name. Elena followed her down a hallway that smelled of disinfectant and broken dreams. Past other veterans in various states of repair and despair. Dr. Brennan was younger than Elena had expected, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and the sort of gentle demeanor that made hardened soldiers want to either open up completely or run for the nearest exit. Elena chose a middle ground, answering questions with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd given this same report to dozens of other doctors, therapists, and well-meaning civilians who could never truly understand. "The nightmares started about 2 weeks after I got back," Elena said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "Same scenario every time. I'm back in Kandahar, in that compound where everything went wrong." Dr. Brennan nodded, making notes. "And these episodes, they're getting more frequent?" Elena stared at a water stain on the ceiling that looked vaguely like a map of Afghanistan. "Every night now. Sometimes during the day, too. I'll be grocery shopping and suddenly I'm back there, hearing the screams, smelling the smoke." What Elena didn't tell Dr. Brennan was that the nightmares weren't random trauma, flashbacks. They were replaying the moment she'd discovered the truth about Operation Fallen Angel, the classified mission that had cost her team their lives and her career. She'd been the sole survivor, not because of luck, but because she'd uncovered evidence that someone high up the chain of command had sold their position to enemy forces. The evidence was buried in a safety deposit box 3 states away, along with her father's Purple Heart and a letter she'd never had the courage to read. But every night, in her dreams, she relived finding those encrypted communications on the abandoned laptop in that Kandahar compound. Every night, she woke up with the same burning question: who had betrayed them? "There's something else," Elena said finally, meeting Dr. Brennan's eyes. "I've been thinking about returning to active duty." Dr. Brennan set down her pen. "Elena, given your current psychological state and the physical limitations from your injuries, I'm not sure that's advisable." "Physical limitations?" Elena's voice carried an edge that made Dr. Brennan pause. "Doctor, with respect, I scored expert marksman on my last qualification despite having a reconstructed elbow. I completed the Ranger School obstacle course 3 weeks after getting my medical clearance. The only limitation I have is other people's assumptions about what I can't do. The room fell silent, except for the distant sound of a helicopter landing on the hospital's helipad. Elena had heard that sound every day for the past 6 months, and each time it reminded her of the life she'd been forced to leave behind. "There's a program, Doctor," Brennan said slowly, as if weighing each word. "It's not official military, but it works with various government agencies. They specialize in unconventional recruitment methods. If you're serious about getting back into operational work, I could make a call." Elena leaned forward. "What kind of program? The kind that doesn't officially exist? The kind that recruits people who've been overlooked or discarded by traditional military structures? They look for specific skill sets and psychological profiles, not just what's written in someone's file." 3 weeks later, Elena received a phone call from a blocked number. The voice on the other end was female, professional, with just a hint of an accent she couldn't place. "Staff Sergeant Rodriguez. My name is Agent Carson. I understand you're interested in returning to operational status. Depends on the operation. Have you ever heard of tactical stress inoculation?" Elena had. It was a controversial training method that subjected operators to extreme psychological and physical stress to prepare them for the worst-case scenarios they might face in the field. Most military branches had abandoned it after several high-profile incidents. But rumors persisted that certain Black Ops units still used modified versions. "I'm listening. There's a facility in Nevada. Officially, it doesn't exist. Unofficially, it's where we test the limits of human performance under conditions that would break most people. We're looking for candidates who've already been broken and put themselves back together." Elena felt something stir in her chest that she hadn't felt since Kandahar. "Purpose. What's the catch?" Agent Carson laughed, a sound like ice cracking. "The catch is that most of our recruits are men who've never experienced real failure. They come in thinking their elite training and testosterone will carry them through. They're usually wrong. And you think I'll be different? I think you've already survived something worse than anything we can throw at you. The question is, are you ready to prove it to people who don't think you belong there?" 2 days later, Elena found herself standing in front of a nondescript government building in downtown Las Vegas, holding a slip of paper with nothing but an address and a time. The building looked like any other office complex, complete with a security guard reading a newspaper and potted plants that were trying too hard to look alive. But when she gave her name at the front desk, everything changed. The bored receptionist's eyes sharpened, and within 30 seconds, Elena was being escorted by 2 men in black suits to an elevator that required a key card and biometric scan to operate. "First time?" asked the taller of the 2 escorts. A man with the kind of build that suggested military experience and the kind of scars that suggested he'd seen combat. "First time for what?" He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "First time volunteering to have your assumptions about yourself systematically dismantled." The elevator descended far longer than should have been possible given the building's apparent height. When the doors finally opened, Elena stepped into what could only be described as an underground military installation. The corridors were lined with blast-resistant concrete, and the air carried the distinct smell of gun oil and determination. "Welcome to Site 7, said the escort. "Officially, you've never been here. Unofficially, this is where we find out if you're as tough as you think you are." They led her through a maze of corridors, past rooms that Elena caught glimpses of through reinforced windows. In one, she saw what appeared to be a mock-up of an airplane cabin. In another, a perfect replica of a Middle Eastern marketplace. Every room was designed to recreate a specific type of high-stress environment. "Psychological conditioning," explained the escort, noticing her interest. "We don't just train bodies here. We train minds to function when everything else is falling apart. They stopped at a briefing room where a dozen other candidates were already seated. Elena was the only woman. The men ranged in age from mid-20s to early 40s, and every one of them had the bearing of someone accustomed to being the most dangerous person in any given room. "Gentlemen," announced a voice from the front of the room. A man in fatigues with no rank insignia stepped forward. He was average height, average build, with the kind of forgettable face that would be perfect for intelligence work. But his eyes were anything but forgettable. They were the eyes of someone who'd seen the worst humanity had to offer, and had somehow managed to maintain his sanity. "And lady," he added, his gaze settling on Elena with what might have been curiosity or might have been contempt, "I'm Instructor Kane. For the next 72 hours, I own your souls. Those of you who survive the initial screening will be invited to participate in the most advanced tactical stress program ever developed. Those who don't," he shrugged, "well, let's just say you'll have some interesting stories to tell at your next therapy session." A few of the men chuckled. Elena remained silent. Studying Kane's body language and vocal patterns, he was testing them already, looking for tells, for weaknesses, for the psychological buttons he could push when the real training began. "Now," Kane continued, "before we begin, I want each of you to understand something. This program has a 97% failure rate, not because the challenges are physically impossible, but because most people discover they're not who they thought they were when everything they rely on is stripped away." He began walking among the candidates, like a predator selecting prey. "You," he said, stopping in front of a mountain of a man with Special Forces tattoos covering his arms. "What's your greatest fear?" "I don't have fears, sire." Kane smiled. "Wrong answer. You're eliminated." The man's face went red. "What? You can't eliminate me for?" "Security," Kane called, and 2 guards appeared as if from nowhere to escort the protesting candidate out. "Anyone else want to start with false bravado?" Elena watched this exchange with growing understanding. This wasn't just about physical or tactical skills. This was about psychological honesty, about the willingness to acknowledge vulnerability as a prerequisite for transcending it. "You," Kane said, stopping in front of Elena, "what's your greatest fear?" Elena met his gaze steadily. "That I'll discover I'm not as resilient as I need to be to find the truth about what happened to my team." Kane studied her for a long moment. "Better? What kind of truth?" "The kind that powerful people kill to keep hidden." A flicker of something passed across Kane's face of surprise. "Respect. Or perhaps recognition." "Interesting. And what makes you think you'll find it here? Because if this program is as advanced as you claim, it'll teach me to function in situations where normal people break down. And whoever betrayed my team in Afghanistan, they're counting on me being normal people." The room had gone completely silent. The other candidates were staring at Elena with mixtures of confusion and grudging respect. They'd come here expecting a military training program. Elena had just revealed this was personal warfare. "Well," Kane said finally, "at least someone understands what we're really doing here." The next 3 days blurred together in a haze of physical challenges, psychological evaluations, and stress tests that pushed every candidate to their breaking point. They were subjected to simulated torture, forced to make impossible ethical decisions under time pressure, and thrown into scenarios where failure meant not just personal defeat, but the simulated deaths of innocent civilians. By the end of the first day, 3 more candidates had been eliminated. By the end of the second day, only 5 remained. Elena and 4 men who'd proven they could maintain tactical thinking even when pushed beyond their apparent limits. The final test came on the 3rd day. Kane gathered the remaining candidates in a briefing room that looked like something from a spy movie, complete with multiple screens, and the kind of high-tech equipment that suggested serious government funding. "Congratulations," he said. "You've survived the screening. Now we see if you're ready for the real program." One of the screens flickered to life, showing what appeared to be satellite footage of a compound in a desert setting. "This is your final evaluation? A simulated hostage rescue in a facility that's been designed to replicate conditions you'd encounter in a real-world operation." Elena studied the compound layout, noting exit routes, potential sniper positions, and areas where civilians might be held. It was remarkably similar to the compound in Kandahar, where her team had been ambushed. "There's a catch," Kane continued. "The scenario includes actors playing hostile forces, innocent civilians, and ambiguous targets, where you'll have to make split-second decisions about who's friendly and who's not. Make the wrong choice, and the simulation ends immediately." "What about equipment?" asked one of the candidates. A former Navy SEAL named Briggs, who'd proven particularly adept at the psychological challenges. "Basic tactical gear, no advanced optics, no communications support beyond hand signals. You'll be operating as an isolated unit with minimal resources, just like you might in a real Black Ops situation." Elena felt a familiar tightness in her chest. This wasn't just a training exercise. This was a recreation of the exact conditions that had led to her team's death in Afghanistan. "Time limit?" she asked. 45 minutes from insertion to extraction. "And here's where it gets interesting. You'll be operating individually, but your scores will be affected by the performance of the other candidates. Succeed alone, and you pass. Help another candidate succeed at the cost of your own mission completion, and you both fail." The rules were designed to create exactly the kind of moral dilemma that had paralyzed Elena's team in Kandahar. Do you prioritize the mission or your fellow soldiers? Do you trust information that might be compromised? Do you take the shot when you're not certain who's hostile? "Any questions?" Kane asked. Elena raised her hand. "What happens to the candidates who fail?" "They go home with a nice story about advanced military training and a non-disclosure agreement that'll keep them quiet until the day they die." "And the ones who pass?" Kane's expression grew serious. "They disappear into a world where their old identities become covers, and their real work begins." 2 hours later, Elena found herself crouched in the shadows of a mock Middle Eastern compound as realistic as any movie set. The other candidates had been inserted at different points around the perimeter, and she could hear the distant sounds of simulated gunfire and shouting in Arabic. Her mission was straightforward in theory: locate and extract 3 high-value targets from different locations within the compound, while avoiding hostile forces and civilian casualties. In practice, it was a nightmare of split-second decisions and incomplete information. Elena moved through the compound with the fluid precision that had made her legendary among the Rangers. Every corner she turned, every doorway she approached, every shadow she slipped through was calculated to minimize exposure while maximizing her ability to respond to threats. But as she progressed through the mission, she began to notice inconsistencies that made her skin crawl with familiar dread. Intel reports that didn't match the physical layout, radio chatter that suggested friendly forces were in positions where she could see they weren't, civilian behavior patterns that didn't quite ring true. This wasn't just a training exercise. This was a reconstruction of exactly the kind of information warfare that had led to her team's ambush in Afghanistan. Elena paused in an alley between 2 buildings, pressing herself against a wall while she processed what she was seeing. The compound layout was different, but the pattern was identical. Someone was feeding the candidates false information, setting them up for failure or worse. The question was whether this was part of the test, or whether someone at Site 7 had their own agenda. She activated her throat mic to check in with Mission Control, but got only static in response. Communications were down, either as part of the scenario or because someone wanted the candidates isolated and vulnerable. A burst of automatic weapons fire from the far side of the compound told her that at least one of the other candidates had walked into an ambush. Elena had to make a choice: complete her mission as briefed or deviate to help a fellow soldier who might be in real danger. Everything in her training said, stick to the mission. Everything in her heart said no one else was dying on her watch. Elena began moving toward the sound of gunfire, using skills she'd developed in Kandahar to navigate through hostile territory without being detected. What she found when she reached the source of the shooting made her blood run cold. Candidate Briggs was pinned down behind an overturned car, taking fire from multiple positions, but these weren't training weapons firing simulation rounds. Elena could see actual muzzle flashes and the distinctive spark of real bullets striking concrete. Someone was trying to kill them. Elena moved into position behind a stack of concrete blocks and began methodically engaging the hostile positions with carefully aimed shots. Her first target went down with the satisfying thump of a well-placed simulation round to the chest. Her second target also dropped, but not before she noticed he was wearing different gear than the other actors in the exercise. "Briggs," she called. "You hit?" "Negative. But this isn't part of the drill. These guys are using live rounds." Elena felt the familiar calm that had always settled over her in combat situations. Someone had turned their training exercise into an assassination attempt, but they'd made the mistake of targeting people who'd already survived worse than anything they could dish out. "Can you move?" she called. "Not without exposing myself to the sniper on the roof." Elena scanned the roofline until she spotted the glint of a scope in the window of a 3-story building. The angle was impossible for a standard shot, but Elena had never been standard. She pulled out her sidearm and fired 3 quick shots. Not at the sniper, but at a hanging chain that suspended a piece of sheet metal above his position. The chain snapped, and the metal dropped with a crash that sent the sniper scrambling for cover, giving Briggs the opening he needed to sprint to Elena's position. "How the hell did you calculate that ricochet?" he panted. "Practice," Elena said grimly. "Now we need to figure out who wants us dead and why." They began moving through the compound together, using tactical movements Elena had perfected in Afghanistan to stay ahead of the hostile forces that seemed to be everywhere. But as they progressed, Elena began to recognize faces among their attackers' faces that didn't belong to actors or training personnel. These were the same contractors who'd been present at the Kandahar operation, the same ones who disappeared from the official records after her team was killed. "Briggs," she said as they took cover in an abandoned building, "I think we're about to learn why this program really exists." "What do you mean?" Elena was about to answer when a voice echoed through the compound from hidden speakers. "Attention candidates. This exercise has been terminated due to safety concerns. Please move to Extraction Point Alpha for immediate evacuation." Briggs started to rise, but Elena grabbed his arm. "Don't. That's not Instructor Kane's voice." "How can you tell?" "Because Kane's dead. I can see his body from here." Through a broken window, Elena pointed to where Instructor Kane lay motionless in the compound's central courtyard, a spreading pool of blood beneath his head. "Jesus," Briggs whispered. "Who the hell are these people?" Elena's mind was racing, connecting dots that formed a picture she'd been trying to see for 6 months. Site 7 wasn't just a training facility. It was a recruitment center for a shadow organization that needed operators who could function outside normal military command structures, but someone had decided that certain candidates, particularly those with knowledge of specific operations, were too dangerous to be allowed to succeed. "The other candidates," Elena said suddenly. "Where are the other 3? As if in answer to her question, a series of explosions rocked the compound. Through the smoke and chaos, Elena could see figures in tactical gear moving systematically through the buildings, clearing them with the precision of a professional cleanup crew. They're eliminating witnesses, Elena realized. Everyone who made it this far knows too much about something. About what? Elena checked her weapon and began moving toward the compound's exit. about who really controls the organizations that are supposed to protect American interests overseas. The next hour became a deadly game of cat and mouse through the compound as Elena and Briggs used every skill they'd learned to stay ahead of the cleanup crew. But Elena was operating on a level beyond anything she'd achieved before, as if the combination of mortal danger and righteous fury had unlocked capabilities she didn't know she possessed. She began picking off the hostiles one by one, using the compound's layout and her knowledge of military tactics to turn their numerical advantage into a liability. Every shot was precisely placed, every movement calculated to maximize damage while minimizing exposure, but more than that, she was gathering intelligence. Every piece of equipment she saw, every communication she intercepted, every face she recognized was another piece of the puzzle that explained what had really happened in Kandahar. As they reached the compound's outer perimeter, Elena finally had enough information to understand the scope of what they were facing. Site 7 was a recruitment front for a private military corporation that had been selling American operational intelligence to the highest bidder. Her team in Afghanistan had stumbled onto evidence of this betrayal, and their elimination had been necessary to protect a network that reached into the highest levels of government and military command. But the conspirators had made one crucial mistake. They'd assumed that Elena had died with the rest of her team. Her survival, and her presence at Site 7, had forced them to launch a desperate cleanup operation that had exposed them far more than they'd intended. "Elena," Briggs called from behind a concrete barrier. "We've got vehicles approaching from 3 directions." Elena could see the dust clouds rising in the distance, indicating a coordinated effort to seal off any escape routes. But she'd spent 6 months preparing for exactly this moment, and she'd learned things about herself during their fight through the compound that changed everything. She wasn't just a survivor of a betrayed military operation. She was someone who could function at peak effectiveness under conditions that would destroy most people. She was exactly what the Shadow Organization had been looking for, except she was pointing her capabilities in the opposite direction. "Briggs," she said, "I need you to do something for me. Name it." Elena pulled a small recording device from her tactical vest, something she'd carried since Afghanistan, in case she ever found evidence about her team's death. "This device has been recording everything that's happened here. I need you to get it to a journalist named Sarah Chen at the Washington Post. She's been investigating private military contractors for 3 years. What about you?" Elena studied the approaching vehicles, calculating angles and timing. "I'm going to make sure they're too busy to chase you." What happened next would become legend among the few people who had security clearance high enough to access the classified reports. Elena Rodriguez, armed with nothing but a basic rifle and 6 months of suppressed rage, held off a professional military unit long enough for Briggs to escape with evidence that would eventually bring down one of the largest private military conspiracies in American history. She used every trick she'd learned in Afghanistan, every insight she'd gained about human psychology, and every advantage she could create in the compound's terrain to turn a hopeless situation into a tactical nightmare for her opponents. But more than that, she did something that no amount of training could have prepared her for. She transcended the limitations that everyone, including herself, had assumed defined her capabilities. When the shooting finally stopped and the smoke cleared, Elena was the only person left standing in the compound. She'd neutralized an entire cleanup crew, preserved crucial evidence of a massive conspiracy, and proven that the most dangerous opponent is someone who has nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. 6 months later, Elena Rodriguez received a Presidential Medal of Freedom in a closed ceremony, attended only by family members and officials with the highest security clearances. The citation was classified, but it recognized her role in exposing a conspiracy that had cost American lives and compromised national security. But the real vindication came 2 weeks after that, when she received a phone call from Agent Carson, same woman who'd recruited her for Site 7, Elena. Carson said, "We have a problem." "We?" "There are 12 other facilities, like Site 7, operating around the country. We think they're all compromised." Elena looked out the window of her new apartment, watching children play in a park where she'd never expected to see again. "And you want me to shut them down? I want you to do what you do best, survive impossible situations and make sure the truth comes out." Elena smiled for the first time since Afghanistan. "When do we start?" The story of Elena Rodriguez didn't end at Site 7. It began there, because sometimes the most dangerous person in the room isn't the one with the most training or the biggest weapon. Sometimes it's the one who's already been broken and has learned to forge something stronger from the pieces. And sometimes, just sometimes, that person is exactly who the world needs when everything else falls apart. 3 weeks after accepting Agent Carson's proposition, Elena found herself standing in the rain outside a defunct airplane hangar in Oregon, watching unmarked vehicles arrive in precise 5-minute intervals. Each vehicle disgorged operatives who moved with the kind of practiced efficiency that came from years of classified work. But there was something different about this group. They all carried themselves like people who'd been burned by their own government. "Welcome to the island of misfit toys," said a voice behind her. Elena turned to see a woman in her 40s approaching, her graying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, and her eyes carrying the weight of someone who'd seen too much. This was Agent Carson in person, for the first time smaller than Elena had imagined, but with an intensity that made the air around her seem charged with electricity. "Colorful metaphor," Elena replied, studying the assembled operatives. "How many of them are like me?" "All of them," Carson said simply. "Every person here was discarded by the system they served, usually after discovering something they weren't supposed to know. The difference is, most of them spent years trying to forget what they learned. You decided to weaponize it." They walked toward the hangar as the last vehicle arrived. Elena counted 15 operatives total, a mix of ages and backgrounds, but all sharing the same aura of controlled lethality. These weren't the type of people you found at recruiting stations. These were the type who'd been forged in fires that officially never existed. "Before we go inside," Carson said, stopping at the hangar's entrance, "I need you to understand something. What you uncovered at Site 7 was just one tentacle of something much larger. The organization we're dealing with has been operating for over 2 decades, and they've infiltrated everything from private military contractors to congressional oversight committees." Elena felt the familiar tightness in her chest that came whenever she thought about the scope of the betrayal her team had died for. "How high does it go?" "High enough that we can't trust normal channels. High enough that this conversation is probably being monitored by someone we can't identify. High enough that everyone in this hangar is technically a traitor to the United States government, even though we're the only ones actually protecting American interests." The hangar's interior had been converted into a sophisticated command center that would have impressed the Pentagon's cyber warfare division. Banks of monitors displayed real-time intelligence feeds from around the world, while tactical equipment that Elena didn't recognize filled workstations arranged in a precise grid pattern. "Ladies and gentlemen," Carson announced to the assembled operatives, "meet Elena Rodriguez. 6 months ago, she was a discharged veteran with PTSD. 3 weeks ago, she single-handedly dismantled a cleanup operation that was designed to eliminate everyone in this room." A murmur of interest went through the group. Elena noticed several operatives studying her with the kind of assessment that came naturally to people accustomed to measuring threats and assets. More importantly, Carson continued, she did it while maintaining operational security, preserving evidence, and ensuring that a fellow operative survived to deliver intelligence that's already resulted in 17 arrests and the shutdown of 4 illegal operations. One of the operatives, A man with the lean build of a long-distance runner and scars that suggested extensive combat experience, stepped forward. Marcus Webb, formerly CIA Special Activities Division, until I asked too many questions about a drone program that was targeting American journalists. Elena shook his hand. Noting the firm grip and direct eye contact of someone accustomed to making rapid trust assessments, what happened when you asked those questions? Car accident. That wasn't an accident. 3 months in a coma, followed by a medical discharge and a pension that disappears if I ever talk to reporters. Similar introductions followed. Sarah Kim, former NSA analyst who discovered that her agency was selling cyber vulnerabilities to foreign governments. David Okafor, former Marine Force recon who'd witnessed war crimes being covered up by private contractors. Jennifer Walsh, former FBI counterintelligence who'd uncovered a money laundering operation that funded terrorism while enriching defense contractors. Each story followed the same pattern. Dedicated service members who'd discovered corruption, tried to report it through proper channels, and been systematically destroyed by the very institutions they'd sworn to protect. Now you understand why we exist, Carson said after the introductions concluded. The traditional military and intelligence structures have been compromised to the point where legitimate operations are impossible. So we've created our own structure, funded by seized assets from the criminals we're targeting and operating under the legal authority of a presidential finding that most of Congress doesn't know exists. Elena absorbed this information while studying the tactical displays around the hangar. What's our first target? Carson activated a large screen that displayed a satellite map of a compound in Montana. Site 3, another training facility, like the one you escaped from. But this one specializes in psychological warfare and interrogation techniques. Our intelligence suggests they're not just training operatives, they're creating them through coercive methods that violate every treaty the United States has signed. The compound looked formidable, even from satellite imagery. Multiple buildings surrounded by concentric security perimeters, with what appeared to be underground facilities that couldn't be fully mapped from above. Current population? Asked Marcus Webb. 47 personnel, including 12 candidates, who we believe are being held against their will. The candidates were recruited through the same methods used to bring Elena to Site 7, but none of them have emerged from the program. Elena studied the tactical situation, her mind automatically calculating approach routes and extraction possibilities. How long have they been inside? The oldest batch has been there for 8 months. We've intercepted communications suggesting that the psychological conditioning they're using is designed to create operatives with no moral limitations, essentially, to turn dedicated service members into programmable assets. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. They weren't just dealing with corruption or even betrayal. They were dealing with an organization that was systematically destroying the minds of American military personnel. What's the official cover story? Elena asked. Advanced SEER training, Sarah Kim replied, reading from a tablet. Survival, evasion, resistance, escape. Completely legitimate on paper, completely horrific in reality. Elena felt something cold settle in her stomach. SEER training was designed to prepare service members for capture and interrogation by hostile forces. If someone had weaponized those techniques to break down and rebuild American personnel, we're looking at the systematic creation of a private army with no loyalty except to whoever's controlling the conditioning, she said. Exactly, Carson confirmed, and based on communications we've intercepted, they're planning to deploy these conditioned operatives in domestic operations within the next 6 months. Elena studied the faces around the hangar, seeing her own determination reflected in their expressions. These were people who'd sacrificed everything to protect American values, only to discover that the greatest threat came from within. What's the plan? Marcus asked. Carson gestured to Elena. That depends on what our newest team member thinks. She's the only one here who successfully infiltrated and escaped from one of these facilities. Elena moved to the tactical display, studying the compound layout with the practiced eye of someone who'd spent years planning impossible missions. But this felt different. This wasn't just about completing an objective or gathering intelligence. This was about saving people who were being tortured in the name of national security. "We can't approach this like a normal tactical operation," she said finally. "If they're using psychological conditioning, then a traditional assault will just trigger protocols designed to eliminate evidence, including the candidates we're trying to save." "What do you recommend?" Carson asked. Elena smiled grimly. The expression that had terrified hostile forces in Afghanistan: "We do something they won't expect." Volunteer. The plan Elena outlined was audacious even by the standards of people accustomed to impossible missions. 2 operatives would infiltrate the facility as candidates, using covers that would pass deep background checks. Once inside, they would locate and extract the imprisoned personnel, while a third team created diversions designed to look like training accidents. "The key," Elena explained, "is that we don't fight their system, we use it against them. These facilities are designed to break people down psychologically, but they depend on the subjects believing they're in a legitimate training program. If we can expose the truth to the other candidates while documenting the illegal activities, we turn their own weapons against them." Marcus nodded slowly. "It's brilliant and completely insane. The best plans usually are," Elena replied. "Who volunteers to be candidates?" Without hesitation, Jennifer Walsh stepped forward. "I've got experience with undercover operations, and my FBI background will make me attractive to their recruitment process." Elena felt a surge of respect for the woman's courage. Volunteering to be psychologically tortured required a level of commitment that went beyond normal operational parameters. "I'll be the second candidate," Elena said. Carson shook her head. "Absolutely not. You're too valuable. And they probably have your biometrics from Site 7. That's exactly why it has to be me," Elena countered. "They think I'm dead. My appearing at another facility will force them to break protocol, which will give us the opening we need to expose their entire operation." The hangar fell silent as everyone processed the implications. Elena was proposing to walk back into the nightmare she'd escaped from, betting her life that the shock of her survival would cause enough chaos to save people she'd never met. "There's something else," Elena said quietly. "In Afghanistan, my team died because I wasn't willing to take the risks necessary to save them. I won't make that mistake again." Carson studied Elena's face for a long moment, searching for signs of the psychological instability that could doom the mission. Instead, she saw the calm determination of someone who'd found their purpose. "All right," Carson said finally. "Operation Ghost Protocol is approved. Elena and Jennifer will infiltrate Site 3 as candidates. Marcus will lead the external support team. Sarah will coordinate intelligence and communications." As the team began detailed planning for the mission, Elena felt the familiar calm that came before dangerous operations. But this time, it was different. This wasn't about following orders or completing objectives assigned by distant commanders. This was about using everything she'd learned, everything she'd survived, to protect people who couldn't protect themselves. 2 hours later, as the team dispersed to begin preparations, Carson pulled Elena aside. "There's something you should know," Carson said. "The psychological conditioning they're using at Site 3, it's based on techniques that were developed to break prisoners in Afghanistan. The same techniques that were probably used on your team before they were killed." Elena felt the old rage stirring. But this time it was tempered by purpose. "They're going to pay for that." "Yes," Carson said simply. "They are." As Elena walked out of the hangar into the Oregon rain, she realized that her journey from broken veteran to elite operative was just beginning. Site 7 had been her resurrection. Site 3 would be her redemption. The war for America's soul was being fought in shadows by people the official history would never acknowledge, but Elena Rodriguez had learned that sometimes the most important battles were the ones nobody was supposed to know about. And sometimes, just sometimes, those battles were won by people who'd already lost everything and had nothing left to fear.